The night over the Eastern Front was never truly silent. Even in the quietest hours before dawn, there was always something. Boots shifting in the mud, distant artillery, the nervous cough of a sentry trying to stay awake. German soldiers stationed near the front lines had learned to live with noise. Noise meant survival. Noise meant warning. But this night was different. It began with silence so complete it felt unnatural. No engines, no sirens, no rumble of approaching aircraft. Just the faint whisper of wind moving through trees and across open fields. Some soldiers barely noticed it at first. Others did, and felt their stomachs tighten, though they couldn't explain why. Then the bombs fell. Not with the thunderous roar of a typical air raid, but suddenly, brutally, as if they had materialized out of the darkness itself. Explosions ripped through supply depots, fuel dumps, and sleeping quarters. Men scrambled from their bunks, shouting warnings that came too late. Anti-aircraft guns swung wildly toward the sky, firing blindly into the dark. Still, there was nothing to see. No engines, no silhouettes, only the wind. Survivors would later swear they heard something just before the explosions. A soft whooshing sound, like a broom sweeping across the night air. A sound so quiet it almost felt imagined. But it happened again, and again, and again. By morning, fear had settled in deeper than the cold. German units began reporting a new kind of enemy attack, one that struck without warning, one that didn't follow the rules of war they understood. Soldiers whispered about invisible planes, about ghosts in the sky, about attackers who didn't want to be heard, only felt. And the most unsettling part, these attacks always came at night. This wasn't a one-time incident. Over the following weeks, it became a pattern. As soon as darkness fell, nerves frayed. Soldiers refused to light cigarettes. Some wouldn't sleep at all. The silence overhead became more terrifying than the roar of bombers ever had. Because when you could hear an engine, you could prepare. When there was nothing but wind, you were already too late. German intelligence was baffled. Reconnaissance flights found nothing unusual. Radar detected little or nothing. The reports didn't make sense. Aircraft that attacked without engines, bombers that seemed to vanish the moment they struck. Yet the evidence on the ground was undeniable. Positions destroyed, supplies gone, morale collapsing. And somewhere above them, unseen, someone was choosing silence as a weapon. What the German soldiers didn't know yet was that these attacks weren't being carried out by elite ace pilots in advanced aircraft. They weren't the result of secret technology or experimental machines. The truth was far more unsettling. Because the pilots responsible for these raids were flying some of the slowest, weakest planes of the entire war. Planes that many commanders had laughed at. Planes that were never meant to survive combat. And the people flying them, they were women. Young, underestimated, dismissed long before they ever reached the battlefield. But on these nights, gliding through the darkness with their engines cut completely, they were turning silence into terror. If you're the kind of person who likes uncovering the stories history almost forgot, the ones hidden behind fear, disbelief, and silence, stay with me. Because this was only the beginning. The enemy had heard the wind, and soon they would learn to fear the women who rode it. Long before German soldiers learned to fear the silence of the night sky, the women who would later be called the Night Witches were fighting a different kind of battle, one that had nothing to do with bombs or enemy fire. They were fighting to be allowed to fly at all. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Red Army was desperate. Entire divisions were being overrun. Aircraft were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Pilots were dying in staggering numbers. The Soviet Union needed everyone it could get, but even in desperation, there were limits. Women were expected to serve as nurses, factory workers, or radio operators. Flying combat missions was considered far too dangerous and far too serious for them. Many senior officers openly mocked the idea. Some laughed outright. Others said women simply lacked the strength, nerves, or aggression required for aerial warfare. Yet the applications kept coming. Young women from across the Soviet Union, some barely out of their teens, wrote letters, filed petitions, and showed up at recruitment offices demanding to be trained as pilots. Many of them already knew how to fly. Some had logged hundreds of hours in civilian aircraft before the war. But their experience didn't matter. They were still told no. Everything changed because of one woman who refused to accept that answer. Marina Raskova was already a national hero, a famous aviator celebrated across the Soviet Union. When the war began, she used her influence to push directly against the highest levels of command. She argued that women could fly just as well as men, and sometimes better. She promised discipline, results, and loyalty. Reluctantly, the Soviet High Command agreed. In late 1941, 3 all-female aviation regiments were authorized. One would fly fighters, another would fly bombers, and the third, almost as an afterthought, was assigned to fly outdated biplanes on nighttime harassment missions. This third unit would later become legendary. At training camps, the women were given almost nothing. Old uniforms meant for men, boots several sizes too large, equipment scavenged from storage. Their planes, Polikarpov Po-2s, were wooden, canvas-covered biplanes designed for training and crop dusting, not war. Male pilots scoffed at them. Some joked that if the women were shot down, the enemy would die laughing. Others made bets on how long they'd last at the front. Weeks, maybe days. The women heard it all. And they didn't argue. They trained. They trained longer hours than most male units. They learned navigation in total darkness. They memorized terrain by moonlight and shadow. They practiced landing on unlit fields, sometimes guided only by a single flashlight, waved briefly and then hidden again. There were no parachutes in many of their planes. Too heavy, commanders said. If they were hit, they would crash. The women accepted this without complaint. They had already decided something important. If they were going to be sent to war, they would not be treated as a novelty. They would be effective. By the time they reached the front, skepticism followed them like a shadow. Officers expected little. Enemy pilots dismissed them entirely. Even friendly units were unsure what to make of them. But none of that mattered once night fell. Because while others relied on speed and firepower, these women would rely on something else entirely: patience, precision, and an understanding of fear. And soon, the people who laughed at them would be listening to the wind, wondering how pilots no one took seriously had become the most unnerving presence in the sky. If this already challenges what you thought you knew about World War II, stay with me. Because what they flew and how they used it was about to turn weakness into a weapon. The planes assigned to the Women's Night Bombing Regiment were not just outdated, they were considered a death sentence. The Polikarpov Po-2 was a relic from another era. Built of plywood and canvas, held together with wire and hope, it had an open cockpit that exposed pilots to freezing wind and enemy fire. It carried no armor, no radio, no radar, sometimes not even basic instruments. At full throttle, it was slower than many enemy fighter planes at their stall speed. German pilots joked that if a PO-2 appeared in daylight, they could shoot it down with a pistol. But these planes were never meant to be seen. At night, their weaknesses became advantages. The PO-2 flew so slowly that it could maneuver in ways faster aircraft could not. It could turn sharply, fly low over trees, and land almost anywhere. Its wooden frame made it difficult for radar to detect, and because it was so light, it barely left a signature in the night sky. Still, flying, it was terrifying. The women climbed into open cockpits, wrapped in layers of clothing against the cold. Frost would form on goggles. Fingers went numb on the controls. Navigation was done by moonlight, memory, and instinct. There were no illuminated runways. Takeoffs happened in near-total darkness. Every mission was dangerous. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky like violent fireworks. Tracer rounds clawed upward, tearing holes through canvas wings. A single hit could turn the plane into a torch. There were no ejection seats, often no parachutes. If the aircraft went down, survival depended entirely on luck. And yet night after night, they went up. The real innovation came just before reaching the target. As they approached enemy positions, the pilots would cut their engines completely. The propeller would stop spinning. The aircraft would begin to glide. In that moment, the PO-2 became almost invisible, silent except for the faint rush of air over the wings. From the ground, it sounded like nothing more than wind passing through branches. German sentries, trained to listen for engines, heard nothing they recognized as danger. Then the bombs dropped. Small payloads, sometimes only 2 bombs at a time, but delivered with precision. Supply lines disrupted. Fuel dumps ignited. Command posts hit again and again. The damage wasn't always massive, but the effect was relentless, and the fear was constant. The women didn't fly 1 mission per night. They flew many, landing, reloading, and taking off again, sometimes 8, 10, even 12 times before dawn. Exhaustion became a permanent state, but so did confidence. They learned the patterns of enemy defenses. They learned which areas were most vulnerable. They learned how long they could glide before restarting the engine, and how quickly they had to disappear before searchlights found them. To German troops below, it felt like torment. The attacks came in waves, just far enough apart to prevent sleep. Every quiet moment became suspicious. Every gust of wind could mean death. Soldiers fired wildly into the darkness, wasting ammunition on shadows, and slowly a nickname began to circulate. At first, it was spoken in frustration, then in fear, and finally in superstition. They were called Nachthexen, night witches, not because of who they were, but because of what they made the night feel like. People who hear this part of the story often assume the fear came only from the bombs, but that wasn't it. The fear came from waiting, from knowing something was out there and not being able to see or hear it until it was too late. And the most unsettling truth of all, this terrifying tactic was born not from advanced technology, but from necessity. What looked like weakness had become something far more dangerous. And in the next chapter, we'll step into the moment when German soldiers finally understood that the silence above them wasn't a flaw. It was the weapon. By the time German commanders began to understand what was happening, the fear had already taken root. Reports from the front were no longer vague or exaggerated. They were specific. Night after night, units described the same pattern. No warning, no engine noise, only a faint rustling sound, followed by explosions. Searchlights swept the sky and found nothing. Anti-aircraft crews fired until their barrels overheated, hitting empty darkness. And still, the attacks continued. What haunted soldiers most wasn't the destruction, it was the waiting. Veterans of the Eastern Front later recalled how nights became unbearable. Men refused to sleep. Some stuffed rags into their ears, hoping not to hear the sound they couldn't stop listening for. Others lay awake, staring upward, convinced that if they relaxed, even for a moment, the silence would turn lethal. The Germans tried to adapt. They adjusted patrol schedules. They increased flak coverage. They stationed extra sentries whose only job was to listen. But the night witches had already learned their enemies' habits. They flew just low enough to stay hidden, just slow enough to glide, and just quietly enough to blend into the wind. The faint noise their planes made, canvas wings cutting through the air, became infamous. Soldiers compared it to the sound of a broom sweeping through the sky. Once heard, it was never forgotten. Psychologically, the effect was devastating. This wasn't a battle you could see. It wasn't even one you could hear clearly. It felt supernatural. German troops began spreading rumors among themselves. Some said the pilots were not human. Others believed they were spirits sent to punish them. Fear fed on itself, growing stronger with every unexplained explosion. Commanders took the threat seriously enough to issue a standing order. Any pilot who managed to shoot down one of these night attackers would be awarded the Iron Cross. That alone revealed how desperate the situation had become. But even with incentives, success was rare. The Po-2's slow speed confused faster German fighters, which often overshot their targets or stalled while trying to line up a shot. Anti-aircraft guns struggled to track something that barely appeared on radar and moved like a drifting shadow. Meanwhile, the women flying these missions understood exactly what they were doing. They listened carefully to enemy fire patterns. They learned when searchlights switched on and off. They learned how fear affected reaction time. Every glide toward a target was calculated. Every bomb drop was deliberate. This wasn't chaos. It was mastery. And it worked. German soldiers began referring to the pilots with a mix of fear and hatred. The name Night Witches stuck, not as an insult, but as an explanation. Something to label the terror that came with the dark, because witches, after all, were said to fly at night, and these women owned the night completely. At this point, it's worth pausing for a moment. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother once said I wouldn't even reach 100 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to the Red Wire Archive, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue, because fear alone doesn't create legends. What came next transformed these pilots from a psychological weapon into something far more enduring. Their name would spread beyond whispered conversations in trenches. It would be written into reports, remembered by survivors, and passed down long after the bombs stopped falling. And in the next chapter, we'll uncover how a mocking nickname, born from fear and disbelief, became one of the most haunting legacies of World War II. The silence had done its job. Now, the world was starting to listen. Names have power, especially the ones given by enemies. At first, Nachthexen was a word spoken in anger, a way for German soldiers to explain something that made no sense. They couldn't see the planes. They couldn't hear the engines. They couldn't stop the attacks. So they reached for something older than logic: witches. In European folklore, witches were believed to fly at night, arriving silently, striking without warning, and vanishing before they could be caught. The comparison felt uncomfortably accurate. The sound of canvas wings brushing through the air became their signature, an omen that meant danger was seconds away. And once that idea took hold, fear did the rest. Soldiers began associating the silence itself with death. A quiet night was no longer comforting. It was suspicious. The absence of sound became a warning. Every breeze through the trees made men tense, fingers tightening on rifles, eyes searching the sky for something they knew they wouldn't find in time. What made the nickname even more remarkable was how little the women knew about it at first. They weren't flying to become legends. They weren't trying to terrify anyone psychologically. Their missions were simple: disrupt supply lines, exhaust the enemy, and survive the night. The fact that fear had become their most effective weapon was almost accidental. But once they understood the effect they were having, they leaned into it. They adjusted flight paths to stretch the suspense. They attacked the same positions repeatedly, ensuring soldiers never knew when the next bomb would fall. Sometimes they flew decoy passes, gliding low just to trigger panic and flak fire, then circled back later for the real strike. This wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. Each mission drained the enemy without requiring overwhelming force. Sleep deprivation weakened morale. Constant fear reduced effectiveness. An exhausted soldier made mistakes. A frightened unit hesitated, and the night witches kept coming. Individually, the bombs they carried were small, but over hundreds of missions, the damage added up. Fuel burned. Supplies vanished. Command posts were forced to relocate again and again. Entire units began dreading nightfall more than combat during the day. Recognition, however, was slow to come. Within the Soviet command structure, these women were still often treated as an oddity. Praise came quietly. Resources remained limited. Losses were accepted with little ceremony. They were expected to endure, and they did. By the end of the war, many of these pilots had flown hundreds of missions each. Some were wounded. Some never came back. Those who survived carried memories of freezing nights, burning skies, and the sound of wind rushing past wings as they cut their engines and disappeared into darkness. And somewhere on the other side of the lines, German soldiers remembered that sound too, not as the noise of a plane, but as the warning that the night witches were near. And yet, when the war ended, something strange happened. Their story began to fade. In the final chapter, we'll look at what became of these women once the bombs stopped falling, and why one of the most terrifying forces of World War II almost vanished from history altogether. Because legends don't always survive peace. Sometimes they have to be rediscovered. When the war finally ended, the night grew quiet again. The skies over Eastern Europe no longer carried the soft whisper of gliding wings. The Polikarpov Po-2s were grounded, their fabric stretched thin from years of service, their wooden frames scarred by flak and time. For the women who had flown them, the transition back to peace was abrupt and strangely empty. There were no victory parades for silent nights. Some of the pilots received medals. A few were named heroes of the Soviet Union. But many returned home quietly, slipping back into civilian life as if they had never terrorized an entire front of the German army. Their regiments were disbanded, their planes were repurposed or scrapped, and their stories, once whispered in fear by the enemy, were slowly buried beneath larger, louder narratives of the war. For decades, the night witches were barely mentioned. History books focused on tanks and generals, on decisive battles and famous aces. The idea that young women flying obsolete biplanes had reshaped nighttime warfare didn't fit neatly into the story of modern, mechanized war. so it was often left out. But the legacy never truly disappeared. Among veterans who survived the Eastern Front, the memory lingered. Some admitted years later that the Night Witches were among the most psychologically devastating forces they had faced, not because of their firepower, but because they took control of fear itself. And among historians, a quiet re-evaluation began. Researchers uncovered mission logs showing how frequently these women flew, sometimes multiple sorties per night, for months on end. They found evidence of how little rest they were given, how limited their equipment was, and how effective they still managed to be. Slowly, the picture became clearer. This wasn't a novelty unit. It was one of the most efficient harassment forces of the entire war. More importantly, their story challenged assumptions that had gone unquestioned for generations about who could fight, who could endure, and who could innovate under pressure. The Night Witches didn't win the war alone, but they changed how it was fought. They proved that creativity could overpower technology, and that courage didn't look the same in every uniform. Today, their legacy lives on in fragments. Photographs of young women smiling beside fragile planes, diary entries written by gloved hands, and accounts from enemies who never forgot the sound of wings cutting through the dark. If you believe stories like this shouldn't be forgotten, stories of people history almost erased, then subscribing is how you help keep them alive. Each story told is another voice pulled back from silence. Because the Night Witches were never meant to be legends. They became legends because they refused to be ignored. And as long as their story is told, the night will never be completely silent again.